Now that Donald Trump's been indicted for the fourth and final time, I'm going to go through each case from least to most serious from my perspective as a former federal prosecutor. The first case to be filed is actually the least serious, and that's the New York case filed by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who made American history by being the first person to charge a former president with a crime. And the allegations in that case relate to illegal hush money payments made by Trump and his lawyer, Michael Cohen, to former porn star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 presidential election to keep her quiet. Now, New York law is interesting in that the charge there relates to false business records, and they're only a felony if those false records were made in furtherance of or to cover up another crime. So prosecutors there are alleging that Trump did this to basically hide an illegal campaign contribution, basically saying that the payment to Stormy Daniels somehow helped his 2016 campaign. So it's a little bit of a tricky legal argument. And if Trump's lawyers can argue successfully that the payment was made for another reason, such as maybe protecting you and your family from embarrassment, then that case goes from being a felony to a misdemeanor. So I think Trump has a pretty good defense in that case, better than the defense he has in the other cases, which would reduce that to a less serious crime, which is why I think that is the least serious of the cases. Next in line in terms of seriousness is the classified documents case in South Florida. And even though it's a serious case, especially because it's in federal court, I think it's less serious than the 2020 election fraud cases. That being said, it's probably the easiest case for prosecutors to prove because the elements are pretty simple, and Trump has admitted to two of them, that he knew the documents were classified and that he intended to keep them anyway. These are statements that he's made publicly on Truth Social and other social media platforms. Now, Trump is of course going to argue that as commander-in-chief, he had the power to declassify the documents, but it's really unclear that he did so. There's a procedure that has to be followed generally, including notifying the appropriate department head and so forth. So from a pure evidence perspective, I think Jack Smith, that's the easiest case there. There's also two co-defendants who have been indicted that might be pressured to flip on the president, and that's Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira. And then there's also obstruction of justice charges in that case, and they broadly relate to, tampering with evidence and witnesses and so forth. But in that case, the National Archives, which is the department in DC that's tasked with maintaining these records, they contacted Trump and his lawyers, and they asked nicely for more than a year for Trump to return the documents. He failed to do so. Then the archive said, well, we're going to make a referral to the Department of Justice. They did make that referral, and the Department of Justice issued a grand jury subpoena. In response to that subpoena, Trump is alleged to have moved documents from the storage room where they were at and other areas in Mar-a-Lago to his personal residence, essentially to hide the documents. There's also some allegations that he or people working at his direction asked employees at Mar-a-Lago to delete video evidence of those boxes being moved. Now, the biggest challenge prosecutors are going to have is, of all the different jurisdictions where Trump has been charged, South Florida is going to be the most favorable jury pool. Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Manhattan are predominantly liberal cities, and you would expect that most potential jurors from those cities are going to be liberal as well and not have a very favorable view of the president. South Florida is mixed, but may even lean a little bit conservative. So, as far as, jury nullification goes, I think that is the part of the country where Trump's lawyers are going to have the best bet. Now, Jack Smith was conservative. He filed there in South Florida instead of DC because he didn't want to deal with a change of venue issue. As we'll talk about, Smith wants to fast track these cases, get them to trial as quickly as possible before next year's presidential election. So by filing in South Florida, he really prevented a potential venue issue that he might lose. The third most serious case is the most recent case that was filed in Atlanta by District Attorney Fani Willis. And that is a broad indictment that alleges Trump and 18 co-defendants worked to try to overturn the 2020 election results. And that's different and potentially less serious than the DC case, which is the most serious case, which I'll explain next. But what's interesting about the Atlanta case is that there's gonna be cameras in the courtroom likely because it's a state case, and that Willis charged RICO, which is generally reserved for criminal organizations like the mob, gangs, or the cartel. But she is alleging that there was a criminal enterprise, Trump and those working at his direction, and they engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. And that activity included trying to intimidate Mike Pence and other government officials to not certify the election results and to participate in a scheme where they were going to submit fake electors instead of the actual electors to prevent Joe Biden from being certified as president. What's interesting about that case is that Willis charged a lot of people, 19 as I mentioned. So usually when prosecutors do that, they want those co-defendants to flip or cooperate against the target of the investigation. Charging them puts a lot of pressure on them to do so. But there's a lot of folks there that are attorneys. So having attorney defendants is really going to slow up the process. They're going to assert attorney-client, executive, and other privileges, which will really delay the case. The other issue is if Trump is reelected and he regains control of the White House, that's really his best defense in all of these cases. So the fact that Willis was last in line, that she took so long to indict Trump, she convened a special grand jury before the regular grand jury, and that grand jury just issued recommendations. So, a lot of folks are asking what took Willis so long. I don't think she's going to be able to get to trial before the general election, given where she is with respect to these other cases and the number of defendants she's charged. Already you have some defendants like Kenneth Chesebro, who is an attorney, who's asserting his right to a speedy trial, which means that unless the court pushes the trial out and there's good cause to waive time, Willis is going to have to try that case this year in 2023. Trump is asking to be severed from the co-defendants because even if some people want to go fast, he wants to go slow. So it's going to be a tough case. The advantage she has, of course, is it's state court, and Trump isn't going to be able to self-pardon. And even though the Department of Justice has long said that a sitting president can't be prosecuted, the Supreme Court has never addressed the issue, at least with respect to a state prosecution. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. I think the most serious of all the cases, though, is the DC federal case. And the reason that's the most serious is federal cases tend to result in longer prison sentences than state cases. And really the judge in that case, who's Tanya Chutkan, has been very hard on the Capitol rioters and has previously ruled against Trump. Trump wanted to prevent his records from being sent to the House committee that was investigating the Capitol riots, the January 6th committee. And the Judge Chutkan, ruled against Trump, saying, presidents aren't kings and they comply with the law. She's also someone who has gone even above the government's recommendations for the rioters. So she viewed the Capitol riots, which a lot of folks think are the culmination of these efforts to overturn the 2020 election, as really an attack and assault on our democracy. She has expressed a willingness to move forward very quickly with the case, so I think it's likely that that case goes to trial before the November election next year. And Jack Smith, the prosecutor in the case, has taken a very targeted surgical approach. Unlike Willis in Atlanta, Smith only indicted Trump. Everyone else, like Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Clark, Chesebro, all these other lawyers, they're unindicted co-conspirators. That doesn't mean they can't be charged later, but at least for the time being, they're out of the case, which allows the government to target and focus on one individual and get them to trial as quickly as possible. I think that's the case that will likely move the quickest, that if Trump is convicted in a very liberal jury pool in DC, I can see Judge Chutkan actually sentencing Trump to prison time. So of all the cases, I think that's the one he should be most worried about and focus his attention on. Thanks for watching, everyone. We're going to be tracking all these cases very closely. We're going to be doing more videos and legal commentary as the cases progress and get closer to trial. In the meantime, please make sure to like, follow, and ring the bell for notifications.